She never imagined her life would shatter in a single night. One moment, Clara Bennett was her father's devoted daughter, clinging to hope after a brutal attack left him fighting for his life. The next, she was staring at an impossible price tag, millions of dollars for treatment that could save him. And then he appeared, Adrian Cross, the coldest, most arrogant millionaire in New York, a man known for building empires out of steel and stone, but never for showing a flicker of humanity. His offer was as shocking as it was cruel. He would pay every cent of her father's medical bills if Clara agreed to marry him. What would you do if love, freedom, and dignity had to be sacrificed for someone you love most? Could you give up your life for a man you barely knew, a man the world believed had no heart at all? This is not just a story about contracts and control. It's a story of two broken souls colliding, of chains turning into choices, and of how even the coldest heart can be warmed by love. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us on this unforgettable journey. The morning had started like any other in Charleston, South Carolina. The September air carried a hint of autumn, that in-between season when the humidity finally began to ease, and the oak trees lining the courthouse square hinted at the burnished reds and golds to come. Clara Bennett loved mornings like this, quiet, full of promise. She had walked the few blocks from her small apartment to meet her father, Judge William Bennett, outside the courthouse. He had insisted they share breakfast before his hearings began. Clara paused on the courthouse steps, balancing a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. Her father always teased that no one could toast a bagel quite like the corner cafe down the street. She smiled to herself as she waited, rehearsing the way she'd hand him his coffee just the way he liked it, black, no sugar. And then, in an instant, everything shattered. The sound came first, a deafening crack that seemed to split the air apart. Clara froze, the smile still half-formed on her face, before the ground shook beneath her feet. A violent explosion ripped through the street, hurling glass, brick, and shrapnel into the air. Her cup of coffee slipped from her hand, spilling across the steps as she turned toward the noise. Her father's car, the sleek black sedan he drove every morning, was engulfed in flames, the force of the blast bending metal like paper. Fire clawed toward the sky, thick smoke pouring upward in a choking wave. Clara's body moved before her mind could catch up. She stumbled forward, bagel bag forgotten, throat raw as she screamed, "Dad!" She tried to run, but a pair of strong arms yanked her back. "Ma'am, you can't stay back." A police officer shouted, pulling her away from the fire. She struggled, panic making her thrash against him. "My father! He's in there! Let me go!" The officer's words blurred into the background. "It's not safe. Step back. The fire department's on its way." None of it mattered. All Clara could see was the car, her father's car, mangled and burning, every second devouring what little chance remained. Her breath came in gasps, smoke stinging her eyes. Sirens wailed in the distance. People screamed and scattered, the air thick with ash. Yet Clara stood rooted, her world narrowing to one unbearable thought: her father might be gone. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Firefighters battled the flames, their voices sharp and urgent. Clara could barely stand, her knees buckled, and the officer guided her to the curb. She pressed trembling hands to her mouth, rocking forward, whispering, "Please, God, please don't let him die." Finally, through the haze of smoke and flashing lights, she saw them. Paramedics wheeled out a stretcher, a charred figure strapped down, oxygen mask pressed to his face. Even through the burns and debris, Clara recognized the familiar silver hair, the set of his jaw. "Dad!" she sobbed, rushing toward him until another medic held her back. "He's alive," the medic told her firmly. "Critical condition, but he's breathing. We're taking him to MUSC Medical. Follow the ambulance if you can." Alive. The word reverberated in her chest like a fragile thread of hope. Clara stumbled to her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the keys into the ignition. She followed the ambulance through Charleston's narrow streets, headlights slicing through smoke still drifting across the city. Every red light, every siren ahead, stretched into eternity. At the hospital, everything blurred: the rush of nurses, the sterile corridors, the acrid smell of antiseptic. Clara paced the waiting room, her chest tight, unable to sit. Images of the explosion replayed in her mind. Her father's car crumpled, flames devouring everything. She pressed her palms together, whispering half-formed prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Hours passed before a doctor finally appeared, his expression grim. Ms. Bennett. She jumped to her feet. Yes. How is he? Your father sustained severe burns and internal injuries from the blast. He's stable for now, but his condition is critical. There is one option, an experimental procedure being done in Switzerland. It's cutting edge, with promising results. But the doctor hesitated. It's expensive, around $7.5 million. The number landed like a physical blow. Clara's breath caught, the hospital walls seeming to close in. 7.5. She shook her head. I can't possibly. The doctor gave her a look of sympathy. I'll have our financial department speak with you. In the meantime, he's being moved to intensive care. You can see him briefly, but only for a few minutes. Clara nodded numbly, following the nurse down the sterile hallway. When she entered the dim ICU room, the beeping of machines was the only sound. Her father lay motionless, his face pale beneath bandages, a ventilator breathing for him. She sank into the chair beside his bed and took his hand, careful of the IV lines. It's me, Dad, she whispered, voice breaking. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay. Her fingers tightened around his. For the first time in her life, Clara Bennett, organized, resourceful, always the one to solve problems, had no plan, only desperation, only love. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought formed. Dark and unshakable, she would do anything, anything to save her father. The ICU had its own kind of silence, heavy and unnatural. Machines hummed and beeped in steady rhythm, but the room itself felt suspended outside of time. Clara sat at her father's bedside, fingers curled tightly around his hand. It was warm, but limp. The doctors had explained his condition in clipped, clinical language burns covering nearly 30% of his body, fractured ribs, lung trauma from the blast. He had slipped into unconsciousness shortly after arriving, and the machines now did the breathing for him. Clara had nodded through their explanations, her brain recording details she wasn't ready to process. What she kept hearing, over and over, was the word critical. Critical meant a razor's edge, one step from survival, one step from death. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, realizing belatedly that her hands were shaking. Her father had always been a strong presence, stern in the courtroom, but tender at home. The thought of losing him left a hollow pit in her chest. When the door opened again, Clara straightened in her chair. A physician in his late 40s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and an expression carefully neutral, stepped inside. He glanced at the monitors, then back at her. Ms. Bennett, I'm Dr. Hamilton. I'm overseeing your father's case. Clara rose quickly. Please, tell me what we can do. Dr. Hamilton hesitated before speaking. Your father's injuries are extensive. Conventional treatment here can stabilize him for now, but his long-term survival chances are limited. There is, however, an experimental program in Switzerland. They specialize in regenerative treatments for severe burn and trauma patients. It could give him a real chance. Clara felt her chest lift with fragile hope. Then let's do it. Sign him up. The doctor's expression softened, but his voice stayed steady. The program is private. The costs are significant, $7.5 million, and insurance will not cover it. The number slammed into Clara like a physical weight. She staggered back against the chair, shaking her head. $7.5 million. That's impossible. I understand, Dr. Hamilton said gently, but I felt you needed to know every option. Your father is stable for now, but time is not on our side. When he left, Clara sank into the chair again, her body heavy with despair. $7.5 million might as well have been 70 million. She had never even seen that much written down, except in news articles about men like Adrian Cross, corporate titans. Untouchable. Her mind scrambled for alternatives. Loans impossible. Her savings. Barely enough for a down payment on a modest home. She pulled out her phone, searching frantically for medical charities, grants, emergency funds. Each page she scrolled felt more hopeless than the last. Waiting lists months long, programs that capped at $20,000, a drop in an ocean. Her hands trembled as she dialed numbers anyway. Old colleagues from her father's law circle, distant relatives, even the bank manager who had once praised her credit score. Each conversation ended the same regretful silence. Polite refusals. The inevitable, "I'm sorry." Clara. By the end of the day, she sat in the hospital cafeteria staring at a cup of coffee gone cold. She had scribbled figures onto the back of a napkin, the pen digging so hard the paper nearly tore. Her calculations always ended the same. She could not reach the number. Not even close. Exhaustion pressed down on her, heavy as lead. She rubbed at her temples, trying to ward off the pounding ache in her skull. For the first time in years, Clara felt utterly powerless. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, sitting at the kitchen table while her father graded case briefs. He'd always reminded her, "Bennett blood doesn't quit. Clara, we fight until the last gavel falls." Tears burned at her eyes. "I'm trying, Dad," she whispered into the empty cafeteria. "But I don't know how to fight this." Night fell over Charleston, but Clara couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital. She curled into the stiff plastic chair beside his bed, her body aching, her heart raw. At some point, she drifted into a restless sleep, waking at every beep from the monitors, every shift of the nurse's shoes across the tile. Morning brought no answers, only another wave of phone calls, rejections, and dead ends. By afternoon, Clara's hope had thinned to a fragile thread. She leaned over her father, pressing her forehead gently against his hand. "You gave your whole life to justice," she whispered. "You stood up to people who tried to bend the law for power, for money, and now I can't even find a way to save you." Her voice cracked. "I'd give up everything I have if it meant you'd wake up and smile at me again." The machines kept their steady rhythm, indifferent to her plea. For the first time since the explosion, Clara admitted to herself a truth she had been avoiding on her own. She could not save him, and yet the thought of giving up was unthinkable. Something would have to change. Something or someone would have to step in. And Clara Bennett, who had always trusted in her own determination, her own strength, felt the creeping dread of desperation take root. She didn't know it yet, but the price of saving her father was about to be written in vows she never imagined speaking. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. Clara sat slumped in the vinyl chair beside her father's bed, her hands folded tight in her lap, as if sheer willpower could somehow knit his body back together. She hadn't left his side in nearly 2 days, except for hurried trips to the vending machine and the occasional stumble to the restroom. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was both a comfort and a torment. Each pulse confirmed he was still alive, yet each reminder was also a ticking clock. $7.5 million. That impossible number haunted every corner of her mind. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at every nerve. At first, she thought she was imagining the sound, the click of polished shoes against the tile floor. Then came the low murmur of a nurse's voice, followed by a deep baritone that carried authority, the kind of voice used to making people listen. "Ms. Bennett." Clara turned, startled. A tall man stood in the doorway, backlit by the sterile hallway light. His tailored charcoal suit fit him with an ease that spoke of wealth and power. His dark hair was perfectly combed, his steel-gray eyes fixed on her with unnerving calm. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in Charleston knew his face. Adrian Cross, CEO of Cross Properties, one of the largest real estate empires in the country. He was the kind of man who made front-page news for buying skyscrapers, for demolishing old neighborhoods, for reshaping skylines to suit his vision. Ruthless, unstoppable, the kind of man who turned lives into line items. Clara rose halfway from her chair, her pulse quickening. Mr. Cross. What are you doing here? Adrian stepped inside as if the room already belonged to him. He took a slow look around the machines, the sterile walls, her father's frail form before resting his gaze squarely on her. I make it my business to know what happens in this city, he said evenly, and I know your father is in critical condition. I also know about the treatment overseas. Clara's breath caught. How could you possibly I know because I asked? Adrian interrupted smoothly. $7.5 million is not a sum you can raise overnight. You've already exhausted the obvious options loans, family, charity. You are out of time, Ms. Bennett. Her hands clenched at her sides. You had no right to pry into my life. I don't concern myself with rights, Adrian replied. His tone was calm, but beneath it was something steely, immovable. I concern myself with results, and I can deliver the result you need. For a fleeting moment, Clara felt hope stir. He was a billionaire if anyone could afford the treatment. It was him. But even as the thought flickered, suspicion crushed it. Men like Adrian Cross never gave without demanding something in return. What do you want? She asked, her voice low, wary. Adrian stepped closer, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. His expression never wavered. Marry me. The words landed like ice water. Clara blinked, sure she had misheard. Excuse me. A legal marriage, Adrian clarified. Nothing more. In return, I'll cover every cent of your father's medical expenses. He'll be on a plane to Switzerland within the week. Clara let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. That's your offer, marriage. You think I'd sell myself like some business acquisition? Adrian tilted his head slightly, unfazed by her anger. I think you understand the value of a contract. Your father's life is worth $7.5 million. That is my price. 1 year of your life, as Mrs. Cross. Her chest burned, outrage and disbelief warring inside her. She wanted to scream at him, to throw him out of the room. But when she looked at her father, pale and motionless against the sheets, the words caught in her throat. She turned back to Adrian, her voice trembling with fury. Why me? You could have any woman in this city, in this country. Why come here? Why me? For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by cool detachment. Because you are intelligent, because you know how to compose yourself in public, and because you have no entanglements that would complicate matters. You are efficient. The word made Clara's stomach twist. He spoke of her as though she were another asset on his balance sheet. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. You're insane if you think I'll agree to this. Adrian's gaze didn't falter. I don't make jokes, Ms. Bennett, and I don't waste time. You need what only I can provide. I need what only you can give. It's as simple as that. Silence hung heavy between them. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears, her breath uneven. She looked at her father again, the rise and fall of his chest shallow beneath the ventilator, the fragile beep of the monitor. $7.5 million. A year of her life. It was no choice at all. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek business card, and placed it on the bedside table. You have 24 hours. Call me when you're ready. He turned to leave, his footsteps measured, deliberate, at the door. Clara found her voice. You have the emotional depth of a calculator. She spat. Adrian paused, glancing back. For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes. Amusement? Perhaps. Then it was gone. All the time, Ms. Bennett, he said smoothly, I'll await your call. And with that, he was gone, leaving behind only the card, the silence, and a decision that threatened to tear Clara in two. The following 24 hours passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Clara barely slept, pacing the hospital corridor until her legs ached. Adrian's business card sat heavy in her pocket, its embossed lettering a constant reminder of the impossible choice before her. Every time she looked at her father's pale face, at the machines doing the work his body could no longer manage, she felt the walls closing in. The numbers ran through her head like a cruel chant: $7.5 million, a lifetime's fortune, a year of her life. By late afternoon, her mind was frayed, but her resolve sharpened. She called the number. The line clicked once, then his voice filled her ear deep, steady, as if he had been expecting her. "Ms. Bennett." Her throat tightened. "We need to talk." "Of course. My office at Cross Tower, 7 o'clock. Don't be late." The line went dead. The conference room on the top floor of Cross Tower looked out over the New York skyline, a panorama of glass and steel. The city glittered in the evening light, indifferent to the turmoil inside Clara's chest. Adrian stood by the window, his reflection sharp against the glass. He turned as she entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. A stack of papers waited on the long, polished table. "You came," he said simply. Clara straightened her shoulders, forcing steel into her spine. "You left me no choice." "There is always a choice," Adrian replied smoothly. "But not all choices lead to survival." He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." She remained standing. "Before we discuss anything, I need to be clear. If I agree to this arrangement, it won't be on your terms alone." One eyebrow lifted, just slightly. "Go on." Clara took a breath, her heart hammering. "I won't be your possession. I keep my career, my independence, and my own bank account. I won't parade around like an ornament at your command. And when this contract ends, you'll establish a foundation in my father's name for victims of violence and intimidation in the justice system." For the first time, Adrian's expression shifted. He studied her, eyes narrowing, as if reassessing. "You've given this some thought. I'm not for sale, Mr. Cross," Clara said firmly. "If I'm agreeing to this, it's because I refuse to let my father die. That doesn't mean you get to strip me of my dignity." The silence stretched. Clara fought the urge to look away. She would not flinch. Finally, Adrian walked to the table, picked up the pen, and tapped it lightly against the contract. "Your conditions are acceptable." Relief swept through her, until he added, "With one adjustment." Her stomach tightened. "What adjustment?" "You'll move into my penthouse immediately. Appearances must be maintained. A newly married couple living apart would invite suspicion, and suspicion is inefficient." Clara clenched her fists. "You speak about marriage like you're negotiating a merger." Adrian met her gaze evenly. "That's exactly what it is. A contract, a partnership, a set of terms agreed upon by both parties. You need my resources, I need a wife. The arrangement is mutually beneficial." The words cut deep, though she tried not to let it show. "And when does this transaction take place?" Adrian glanced at his watch. "Tomorrow morning, City Hall. I've arranged everything." Clara's breath caught. "Tomorrow. That's insane." "Efficient," he corrected. "Your father's transport to Switzerland is scheduled for the following day. Time is not a luxury we can afford." She pressed a hand against the table, steadying herself. The room seemed to tilt around her, the city lights beyond the glass a blur. Tomorrow. By this time tomorrow, she would be Adrian Cross's wife. Adrian extended the pen toward her, his movements precise, controlled. Their fingers brushed as she took it, the briefest spark of contact making her pulse stutter. She quickly pulled back, focusing on the paper. "Before I sign," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor inside, "I need one more guarantee." His brows lifted. "Which is in public. You treat me with respect. No humiliation. No careless words that turn me into a punchline. If we're going to pretend this is real, then it has to look real. I won't be your accessory." A flicker passed through his eyes. Surprise, maybe even admiration, but his tone remained cool. Agreed. Clara lowered her gaze to the contract. Each clause, each stipulation, stared back at her like a prison wall. 1 year, a year of her freedom, traded for her father's life. Her hand trembled as she signed. With every stroke of the pen, she felt something slip away: her independence, her future, her sense of control. When she finished, she placed the pen down carefully, as if it might burn her fingers. Adrian leaned forward, adding his own signature with swift, confident strokes. He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers. "Congratulations, Ms. Bennett. You are now the future Mrs. Cross." Clara forced a brittle smile, her voice laced with quiet defiance. "And you, Mr. Cross, have just purchased yourself the world's most reluctant bride." For the briefest instant, something almost human flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it came. As he gathered the papers, Clara's mind churned. Tomorrow she would step into a role she had never asked for, chained by duty and desperation. And yet, somewhere beneath the fear and anger, a single thought took root. If she was going to lose a year of her life, she would not do it silently. She would fight, in her own way, because even chains could rattle. The morning broke gray and unremarkable, the kind of day that could slip past unnoticed in a city where steel towers blocked out the sky. For Clara Bennett, however, it would be impossible to forget. She stood before the mirror in a borrowed hotel room, staring at her reflection. The white dress hanging from her shoulders was not the gown of little girl daydreams. No lace, no sweeping train, no veil trailing behind her. It was simple, almost severe, a knee-length sheath chosen for efficiency, not romance. Her hair, usually loose and soft, was pulled back into a low bun by a stylist Adrian had hired. She hardly recognized the woman staring back. The knock at the door came promptly. "It's time," said a woman's clipped voice, Adrian's assistant, no doubt. Clara forced her feet to move, each step echoing in her chest like a tolling bell. City Hall was buzzing with reporters. Word had spread that Adrian Cross, the untouchable real estate mogul, was marrying. Photographers lined the steps, cameras flashing as soon as the sleek black town car pulled up. Clara felt the press of the crowd before the door even opened. Adrian stepped out first. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his posture exuding control. He offered his hand to Clara as if they were stepping onto a red carpet instead of into a contract. For a moment, she considered refusing, but the lenses snapping around them left her little choice. She slid her hand into his, cold against cold, and together they mounted the steps. Inside, the ceremony was brief, almost perfunctory. A city clerk shuffled papers, her voice droning through the legal phrasing. Clara heard none of it. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, her mind replaying memories of her father. She remembered the times he had teased her about wedding plans, joking that he would walk her down the aisle someday. There was no aisle today, no proud father, no friends gathered to celebrate, only silence, ink, and obligation. "Do you, Adrian Cross, take Clara Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the clerk asked. "I do," Adrian replied without hesitation, his tone cool, unflinching. "And do you, Clara Bennett, take Adrian Cross?" Her voice stuck in her throat. She glanced sideways at him, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp as steel. This was no love story. This was survival. "I do," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. The clerk signed her name with a flourish and snapped her booklet shut. "By the authority vested in me by the state of New York, I now pronounce you husband and wife." There should have been cheers, music, the rustle of bouquets. Instead, there was only the scratching of pens as they signed the documents. Adrian's signature was bold, decisive. Clara's trembled slightly, each letter sealing away a part of herself. When they stepped outside, the photographers surged forward like vultures sensing prey. "Mr. Cross over here," Who's the lucky woman? The barrage of questions rose into chaos, flashes exploding against the dull morning light. Clara blinked against the glare, disoriented. She felt Adrian's hand settle firmly at her waist, guiding her down the steps with steady precision. To the cameras, it might have looked gallant. To Clara, it felt like choreography calculated, practiced. Smile, he murmured, his lips barely moving. She forced her lips into the ghost of a smile, though inside she felt hollow. At the curb, a sleek black Bentley waited. Adrian opened the door for her, with a gesture so smooth it bordered on theatrical. Clara slid inside, clutching her purse like a lifeline. The car's tinted windows shut out the noise, replacing it with a suffocating silence. Adrian joined her, immediately pulling out his phone. His fingers moved with mechanical precision across the screen, already returning to business. For him, this had been a transaction completed, a box checked. Clara turned to the window, her reflection blurred against the passing city. She thought of her father, still unconscious, still fighting. This marriage would buy him a chance. That was all that mattered. But in the quiet of the car, a truth pressed down on her. She had given up more than she realized. It wasn't just a year of her life. It was her freedom, her choices, her very sense of self. Adrian's voice cut through her thoughts. Your father's transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The medical team confirms he's stable enough to fly. Clara swallowed hard, nodding. Thank you. He looked up briefly, as if the words surprised him. His gaze lingered for a moment, unreadable, before he returned to his phone. It's part of the agreement, he said flatly. Agreement. Contract. Marriage. The words blurred together, each as cold as the man beside her. The car pulled onto the highway, skyscrapers rising like walls around them. Clara pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the vibration of the city, the weight of her new reality. She had become Mrs. Adrian Cross, not out of love, not out of choice, but out of desperation. And though the world outside might call it a fairy tale, Clara knew the truth. This was no wedding. This was a binding, a chain clasped around her soul. The private elevator glided upward without a sound, carrying Clara to the very top of Cross Tower. She stood rigid, her small suitcase at her side, her hands gripping the handle so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The ride felt endless, though the numbers above the door ticked upward in rapid succession. When the elevator doors finally opened, the first thing Clara noticed was the silence. No bustle of neighbors, no distant hum of traffic, only a vast, quiet expanse. The penthouse stretched before her like a cathedral of glass and steel. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline in sharp angles, the evening light glinting off endless panes. Her heels clicked against polished marble as she stepped inside. The space was immaculate, every surface gleaming, every piece of furniture precisely positioned. Monochrome art hung on the walls, abstract shapes in muted grays and blacks. It was beautiful in a way that felt cold, like walking into a museum where nothing could be touched. Clara drew a shaky breath, feeling the weight of it press against her chest. This was not a home. This was a fortress. Adrian followed behind her, his presence as commanding as the penthouse itself. He set his phone on the console table with a practiced motion. Your belongings have been delivered. The staff arranged them in the East Wing suite. You'll find it adequate. Adequate. The word stung more than it should have. Clara forced herself to nod. Thank you. Dinner is at 7, Adrian continued, his tone clipped. The household staff will introduce themselves tomorrow. Tonight. I thought it best you have time to adjust. Adjust. As if she could ever adjust to this. Clara wanted to scream that this wasn't her life, that her real home was back in Charleston, with creaky wooden floors and shelves crowded with her father's old law books, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee grounds no matter how often she scrubbed it. But instead, she bit her tongue. Adrian glanced at his watch. I have calls to make. If you need anything, ask Vance, the house manager. He's discreet, and just like that, he was gone, retreating to an office somewhere down the hall. Clara let out a long, shaky breath. She rolled her suitcase across the cavernous living room, the wheels echoing in the stillness. Every step made her feel smaller, swallowed by the sheer scale of the place. When she reached the suite Adrian had mentioned, she found her clothes already unpacked, neatly arranged in a walk-in closet that was larger than her entire bedroom back home. The sight of her simple blouses and worn jeans among the polished wood and glass felt almost absurd, like a child's toys scattered in a palace. She sank onto the edge of the bed, running a hand over the pristine duvet. Her throat tightened. She should have felt grateful this room alone was worth more than her entire apartment lease. But all she felt was displaced, untethered. Her gaze fell to the small item she had carried up from the car, the one thing she had insisted on handling herself, a modest ceramic pot holding a pothos plant. Its leaves drooped slightly from the journey, edges browned, but it was alive. Clara lifted it gently from the suitcase and placed it on the windowsill. Against the backdrop of the glittering city, the little plant looked fragile, almost laughably out of place. But to her, it was a piece of home. She whispered, "There. At least I won't be the only living thing trying to survive here." The words surprised her, half bitter, half tender, and a lump rose in her throat. Night descended quickly, the city outside bursting into light, neon signs and headlights streaking the glass. Clara curled into the armchair by the window, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on the plant. She thought of her father lying in the hospital, unconscious but fighting. She thought of the Charleston apartment she had abandoned, the wall lined with family photos, the warmth that money could never buy. Here, surrounded by marble and steel, she had never felt farther from herself. When the door clicked softly, Clara startled. Adrian entered, jacket removed, shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He carried 2 glasses of water. Without a word, he set one on the table beside her. "You should drink," he said simply. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you." Adrian studied her for a moment, his eyes flicking briefly to the small plant on the sill. "You brought that?" "It's mine," she said defensively, hugging her knees tighter. A faint, unreadable expression crossed his face. "Plants don't usually survive well here. Too little natural light." "Then I'll find a way to keep it alive," Clara replied firmly. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer, then he nodded once. "Dinner is ready." When he left again, the silence rushed back. Clara looked at the plant, her voice low. "We'll survive this together. Won't we?" She wasn't sure if she was talking to the plant or to herself. For the first time since the wedding, Clara allowed the tears to come, silent and hot, rolling down her cheeks. She wept for her father, for the life she had left behind, and for the strange but sterile future stretching before her. But when she finally wiped her eyes, she looked again at the little plant, a fragile thing in a hostile place, yet still alive. So was she, and she would find a way to endure. The days blurred together in a rhythm that belonged entirely to Adrian Cross's world. It was a world of rigid schedules and polished surfaces, where nothing was left to chance and everything served a purpose. Mornings began early, before the sun reached the city skyline. Clara would often find Adrian already awake, dressed in his immaculate suits, his breakfast a single cup of black coffee consumed, while scrolling through reports on his tablet. He rarely spoke more than a curt, "We leave at 8," before striding toward the waiting car. Clara, once free to plan community fundraisers and meet friends for late afternoon walks, now found her calendar dictated by his assistant. Board luncheons, charity galas, magazine interviews, each event another stage where she was expected to perform the role of Mrs. Cross, graceful, poised, smiling on command. At first, she stumbled through them. The flash of cameras blinded her. The pointed questions of reporters made her throat dry. But Adrian never faltered. He stood beside her, hand at her back, answering with clipped precision. When she hesitated, he would lean down, his breath brushing her ear. "Smile, now." It wasn't a request. It was an order. The public adored it. Adrian Cross finally settles down. One headline declared, "Meet the woman who tamed the tycoon." Another gushed, Clara wanted to laugh at the absurdity. There was nothing tamed about him. If anything, she felt like the one trapped, pacing behind gilded bars. And yet, there were moments, small, fleeting cracks in the marble facade. One evening after a gala, Clara returned to the penthouse, her feet aching from hours in stilettos. She kicked them off in the foyer, wincing as she rubbed her toes. Adrian entered behind her, his expression unreadable as always. Then, without a word, he disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, he returned, holding a glass of water. He placed it beside her. Not meeting her eyes, "Hydrate," he said simply, before walking away. Clara sat there, stunned. It was such a basic gesture, yet it unsettled her more than his cold commands. For a brief second, he had seen her not the actress on display, not the contract bride, but Clara, a woman whose feet hurt after a long night. Another time, in the back seat of the Bentley. She had been scrolling through photos on her phone, pictures of her father smiling at a backyard barbecue, his arm around her shoulders. Her chest ached with longing. She hadn't noticed Adrian glance up from his phone until he spoke. "He'll recover," Adrian said quietly. "The Swiss team is the best." Clara's head snapped toward him, surprised by the softness in his tone. Before she could respond, he looked back down at his screen, as if the words had escaped him by accident. These glimpses unsettled her more than his commands ever could. It was easier to despise a man who was only ruthless, only arrogant, but a man capable of small kindnesses unexpected, uninvited, that left her confused. In private, their conversations were sparse. Adrian's life was a litany of meetings, numbers, acquisitions. He spoke of efficiency the way others spoke of religion. To him, emotions were distractions, indulgences. And yet, Clara caught him sometimes late at night, standing by the window, his tie loosened, staring out at the city with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't coldness, it was something else, something almost human. She didn't dare ask what he was thinking. Inside, Clara was at war with herself. Part of her bristled at every command, every orchestrated public smile. She hated the way he treated marriage like a balance sheet. She hated the loss of freedom, the constant performance. But another part, deep, quiet, dangerous, was curious. Who was Adrian Cross when no one was watching? What made him build this empire of glass and stone? What wound carved away the man beneath the armor? The questions gnawed at her, even as she despised herself for asking them. Late one night, curled in bed with the city lights flickering against the curtains, Clara whispered into the darkness, "I hate you." But the words rang hollow, because tangled somewhere inside, the hatred was something else, an unwilling fascination with the man who had chained her life to his. And that was the most terrifying part of all. The ballroom glittered beneath chandeliers that dripped with crystal light. It was one of the city's most exclusive charity events, a night where fortunes were displayed as casually as cufflinks, and reputation was the true currency. Clara stood beside Adrian, her gown a deep sapphire that hugged her form without trying too hard. She'd chosen it herself, determined not to look like another ornament selected by his assistant. The cameras swarmed as soon as they entered. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes burst like fireworks. Clara felt her nerves tighten, her smile practiced but brittle. She could sense Adrian beside her, tall, immovable, his presence commanding without effort. Then, without warning, he reached for her hand. His fingers slipped around hers, firm, steady. It was a simple gesture, one couples did 100 times a day. But for Clara, it was a jolt straight to her chest. Her breath hitched. For the cameras, it looked perfectly staged, Mr. and Mrs. Cross, united, glamorous, yet the warmth of his palm against hers felt startlingly real. She dared a glance at him. His expression was calm, unreadable, his gaze fixed on the flashing lights. If it was just for show, he didn't let it slip. But Clara's pulse refused to slow. When the photographs were done and the pair moved deeper into the ballroom, Clara withdrew her hand quickly, almost defensively. But the ghost of the touch lingered, unsettling her in ways she couldn't name. Dinner passed in a blur of introductions and polite conversation. Adrian navigated the room like a general, every nod, every handshake executed with precision. Clara played her role, offering smiles, answering questions, deflecting curiosity about their whirlwind marriage. It wasn't until later, when the crowd thinned and the orchestra's music softened, that she found herself momentarily alone with him near the edge of the dance floor. "You surprise me," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "How so?" "The hand-holding," she said. "You don't usually improvise." His lips twitched just barely, not quite a smile. It seemed efficient. Photographs carry more weight when the illusion is convincing. Clara crossed her arms, masking the flutter in her chest. Efficient? Of course. He studied her for a moment, and then his gaze drifted toward the far end of the ballroom, where a small auction table displayed rare items, a violin, a painting, a first-edition book. His attention lingered on the book. "You read?" Clara asked, surprised. Adrian glanced at her. "Why does that surprise you?" "Because you strike me as someone who processes information through spreadsheets and contracts, not novels." A pause. "Then I have a library at the penthouse. My grandfather started it. I've added to it over the years." Clara blinked. It was the most personal detail he had ever shared with her. "What do you read?" "History, biographies, occasionally literature." His gaze softened almost imperceptibly. Words can build empires as easily as steel. For a moment, Clara forgot the contract, forgot the cameras, forgot everything but the man standing beside her. The steel-gray eyes that had always seemed cold now held a flicker of something else. Depth, humanity. She looked away quickly, her throat tight. This was dangerous, seeing him as more than the ruthless businessman who had trapped her in a gilded cage. When the evening ended, Adrian offered her his arm. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The cameras outside were waiting, but this time, when his hand covered hers, she didn't pull away. Back in the penthouse, Clara set her purse down and slipped off her heels, her mind replaying the night in fragments the way his hand had felt in hers, the quiet revelation about his grandfather's library. She stared at the little plant on the windowsill, its leaves reaching toward the faint city light. "Don't look at me like that," she whispered to the plant, half ashamed, half defiant. "It doesn't mean anything." But the truth lingered in her chest, undeniable for the first time. Adrian Cross had felt less like a prison warden, and more like a man. And Clara Bennett, despite herself, was beginning to wonder who he really was. The Harrington Hotel ballroom gleamed like a golden cage, every surface polished, every laugh too sharp. Clara sat at Adrian's side, her wine glass untouched as the evening stretched into yet another parade of introductions and veiled judgments. She had become practiced at smiling, at tilting her head just so, at answering invasive questions with polite brevity. But there was always someone willing to push further. Tonight. It was Elise Whitmore, an investor's wife with diamonds like ice around her throat and a smile that never reached her eyes. She leaned across the table, her voice just loud enough to carry. "So, tell us, Mrs. Cross," Elise said, dripping with false sweetness. "What exactly were you doing before you landed the city's most eligible bachelor event planning? Was it quite the leap, isn't it? From arranging centerpieces to this." The table chuckled softly. Clara's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth, ready with the carefully rehearsed line Adrian's PR team had given her, when she felt his hand rest lightly on her forearm. Adrian's gaze shifted to Elise, his tone deceptively mild. Clara was already managing high-profile events attended by judges, senators, and business leaders long before you ever stepped foot in one of my boardrooms. Elise. If anyone at this table understands how to handle power with grace, it's her. The laughter died instantly. Elise's smile faltered. Clara blinked, stunned. She turned to Adrian, expecting cold calculation in his eyes. Instead, She found something sharper, protective, deliberate. He hadn't needed to defend her. Not for the cameras, not for his reputation, but he had, for the rest of the dinner. Clara felt the warmth of his hand where it had briefly touched her, long after he withdrew it. Later that night, outside the hotel, the paparazzi swarmed as always. Clara braced herself for the flash of cameras, the barrage of questions. Adrian's arm settled around her waist, steadying her against the crush of bodies. "Mr. Cross, kiss your bride. Prove it's real," someone shouted from the crowd. Clara froze. The contract outlined acceptable public displays, hand-holding, polite smiles, but never a kiss. She turned to Adrian, panic flickering in her chest. He met her gaze, steady, unreadable. Then, without a word, he cupped her cheek with surprising gentleness and leaned down. The world erupted in flashes. Clara's breath caught as his lips brushed hers, not cold, not mechanical, but warm, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Her knees nearly buckled. For one dangerous second, she forgot the cameras, the contract, everything except the press of his mouth against hers. When he pulled back, the world roared around them, but inside Clara, there was only silence. Her heart thundered. Her skin tingled where he had touched her. In the car, she stared out the window, trying to steady her breathing. "That wasn't in the agreement," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian adjusted his cufflinks, his expression calm. "It was necessary." "Necessary?" she repeated, her chest tight. "For appearances," he said smoothly. "The rumors will stop now." But Clara heard the faint roughness in his tone, the almost imperceptible hesitation, and it frightened her more than his coldest words. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if the kiss had been for the cameras or for them. That night, back in the penthouse, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts churned. She hated him, hated the way he had cornered her into this marriage, the way he dictated her life. And yet, she touched her lips, remembering the warmth, the way his hand had steadied her against the chaos. It wasn't supposed to feel real. Her father's face rose in her mind, frail, fighting for life thousands of miles away. "This marriage is for him," she reminded herself. "It's a contract, nothing more." But as sleep finally overtook her, one truth lingered. Stubborn and terrifying contracts didn't make her heart race. That kiss had, and Clara Bennett, against all reason, was beginning to wonder if the walls of ice around Adrian Cross were not as unbreakable as she once believed. The gala at the Metropolitan Conservatory was the kind of event that fed the city's rumor mills for weeks. Waiters moved through the glittering crowd with trays of champagne, while a string quartet played in the corner. Clara adjusted the strap of her emerald gown, trying not to feel the weight of the stares that always followed her, now. Being Mrs. Adrian Cross had made her a fixture in society overnight. Though not one universally welcomed, Adrian, as always, was the picture of control. He stood tall, speaking with a board member about a new project, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room like a general surveying the battlefield. Clara lingered at his side, smiling where expected, nodding at names she barely remembered. The evening seemed smooth until the sudden raised voice shattered the calm. "You don't belong here." Cross the string quartet faltered, heads turned. At the entrance stood a man in a crumpled suit, his face flushed with fury. Security hesitated, caught between discretion and action. Clara saw Adrian stiffen beside her. The man shoved past a waiter, his voice rising. "You ruined me. You cast me out after 20 years of loyalty because I wouldn't bow to your damned efficiency models." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Clara's chest tightened as she recognized the name murmured around her. Michael Grant, a former director at Cross Properties. She remembered seeing his face in old news clippings, disgraced, dismissed after a quiet scandal. Michael's gaze locked on Adrian with venom. "You're a machine, Cross. You don't care about people-only numbers. You bleed your employees dry, then discard them when they can't keep up." And now his eyes swept to Clara. narrowing with disdain. You've even turned marriage into a contract. A hush fell. Cameras clicked. This was blood in the water. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His silence felt deliberate, controlled, but Clara sensed the storm beneath it. Without thinking, she stepped forward. Her voice rang out, clear and steady. "You're wrong?" Every eye turned to her. Michael blinked, thrown off by her sudden defiance. Clara lifted her chin. Adrian Cross values integrity. He doesn't tolerate fraud, or lies, or people who put profit above safety. That's why you were fired, isn't it, Mr. Grant? The man's face reddened. You endangered workers to pad your numbers. Clara pressed, her tone sharp. You gambled with lives, and when you were caught, you called it efficiency. That's not loyalty, that's selfishness. The crowd stirred, some nodded, whispering agreement. Michael sputtered, searching for words, but security closed in now, emboldened. They ushered him toward the exit, his protests fading into the marble hall. Silence lingered, then, slowly, the quartet resumed their music, and the hum of conversation returned. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. She felt Adrian's gaze on her before she dared look at him. When she finally did, the sight startled her. The mask of cold precision was still there, but behind it, something else. His eyes softened, just slightly. Vulnerability, gratitude. For the rest of the evening, Adrian said little, but his hand found hers beneath the table, his grip steady, lingering longer than necessary. He didn't look at her, didn't thank her aloud, but Clara felt the shift. For the first time, Adrian Cross had allowed her to stand at his side, not as an accessory, not as a contract, but as an ally. And that, Clara realized with a pang both thrilling and terrifying, was more dangerous than any public scandal. The penthouse was quiet when Clara returned that evening. The silence, once oppressive, had grown familiar in its own way. Adrian was still at a late board meeting, and the staff had long since gone. She dropped her clutch on the marble counter, toeing off her shoes as she made her way through the vast space. Her gaze fell, as it often did, on the small plant on the windowsill. Its leaves had perked up since she'd brought it, reaching toward the faint glow of the skyline. She smiled faintly, brushing a fingertip along one leaf. At least one of us is adapting, she thought. She crossed to the kitchen, looking for a glass of water. That's when she noticed it, a slim folder left on the counter, unmarked, almost deliberately plain. It stood out in this temple of order and control. Curiosity tugged at her. She hesitated, then pulled it closer. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside, neatly clipped and arranged, were legal documents, pages stamped with official seals, paragraphs in tidy legalese. At the top of the first page, the title glared at her in bold letters, Dissolution of Marriage Agreement. Her stomach dropped. She gripped the edge of the counter, her hands trembling. Page after page outlined terms for separation, property divisions, financial settlements, clauses that ensured discretion. Her name, Clara Bennett Cross, appeared in black ink across multiple lines, like a brand. She skimmed furiously, her vision blurring. The language was cold, surgical, generous in financial terms. Yes, but absolute in its intention. It was a roadmap for dismantling everything they had built together. Her knees buckled. She staggered onto a stool, clutching the folder to her chest as if it might stop the ache spreading through her ribcage. He planned this, from the start, or after. The thought twisted in her mind, sharp and unbearable. Every moment replayed his defense of her at the gala, the way his hand had lingered in hers, the softness in his eyes after she had stood by him. Had it all been theater? Had she been a fool to believe there was something real flickering beneath the ice? Her chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. Rage surged, hot and dizzying, drowning out the tears that threatened. She slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing across the marble countertops. "How dare you?" she whispered into the empty room. "How dare you let me think?" Her voice broke, cracking into silence. She thought of her father, safe in Switzerland, recovering steadily. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the dignity she had bartered, the life she had surrendered. She had given up everything to stand by Adrian, to endure the whispers, the scrutiny, the endless performance. And this was what she found waiting for her. A pre-written escape, a contract to end their contract. The betrayal stung deeper than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just about the papers. It was about the way she had begun, against her better judgment, to believe in him, to believe that behind the coldness was a man capable of more. Clara pressed a hand to her lips, as if she could push the truth back down, but it was too late. He had been planning her exit all along. The sound of the elevator doors opening startled her. She shoved the folder back onto the counter just as Adrian stepped inside. He loosened his tie, looking every inch the untouchable mogul, until his gaze flicked to her. "You're still awake," he said simply. Clara's nails dug into her palms. Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady. "How long were you going to wait before telling me?" Adrian paused, his expression unreadable. "Telling you what?" She gestured sharply to the folder. "Don't play dumb. I saw it. The divorce papers." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush her. Adrian's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to her. For once, he didn't look in control. His jaw tightened, his posture rigid. Clara's chest heaved. Was this the plan all along? To use me until my father's treatment was secure, then toss me aside like a business deal. "You'd already closed?" Adrian said nothing, and his silence was worse than denial. Tears burned her eyes, but fury kept them from falling. "I defended you," she whispered, "against them, against everyone who called you a machine. I thought I saw something real in you, and all this time, you were preparing to end it." Her voice cracked. "Tell me I was wrong. Tell me it meant nothing. Tell me I'm just another entry in your ledger." But he didn't. He stood there, silent, the weight of his gaze unbearable. Clara shook her head, her heart splintering. "You don't even have the decency to lie to me. Do you?" She grabbed her purse from the counter, her movements jerky, unsteady. "I won't be here when you decide to finish what you started." And before he could stop her, she swept past him, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Adrian Cross, so powerful, so unshakable, stood alone in the gleaming penthouse, staring at the folder he had left behind. For Clara, the betrayal was complete, and for the first time since their marriage began, she wished she had never signed her name at all. Rain slicked the streets of Manhattan the next morning, the kind of cold drizzle that soaked through coats and left the city looking grayer than usual. Clara didn't notice. She strode across the marble lobby of Cross Tower with her jaw set and her pulse racing, clutching the strap of her bag like a lifeline. The receptionist rose, startled. "Mrs. Cross?" "Don't bother," Clara snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. She pressed the elevator button with trembling fingers, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. By the time the doors opened to the top floor, her fury had solidified into resolve. She marched down the corridor, past rows of closed offices, until she reached the heavy oak door at the end. Without knocking, she shoved it open. Adrian sat behind his desk, papers neatly stacked, his suit immaculate as ever. But when he saw her, his composure flickered. "Clara!" He stood quickly. "You shouldn't. Don't you dare tell me where I should or shouldn't be." Her voice cracked with the effort to hold back everything boiling inside her. She pulled the folder from her bag and slammed it onto his desk. "You were just going to let me find this divorce papers." After everything, Adrian's jaw tightened. He looked at the folder, then at her. His silence stretched until she could barely breathe. "Say something," she demanded. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. For once, he looked less like the untouchable mogul and more like a man cornered. "I wasn't planning to give them to you. Not yet." Clara's laugh was bitter, humorless. "Oh, that makes it so much better. You only prepared my exit in advance. How thoughtful." His voice was low, rougher than she had ever heard it. "You don't understand. Then make me understand, she shot back. Because right now, it looks like I was nothing more than a deal to you. A transaction to be terminated once my father didn't need you anymore. Adrian's hands curled against the edge of the desk. That isn't true. Isn't it? Clara's throat burned. Then why would you draw up those papers? The silence that followed was different this time, charged, aching. Finally, Adrian spoke, each word torn from him like it cost something. Because I was terrified. Clara blinked, stunned, terrified. He nodded once, the admission heavy. Your father's doctors called me. His recovery is going better than expected. Soon he won't need the facility in Switzerland. He'll be home. And when that happened, his gaze locked on hers, raw and unguarded. I thought you'd walk away, that you'd finally be free of me. And he broke off, his voice rough. I couldn't bear the thought of watching you leave. The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared, disbelief flooding her. So, you decided to leave me first, to write me out of your life before I could do it myself. Adrian swallowed hard. It seemed kinder. Kind. Her voice rose, shaking. You think betrayal is kindness? You think tearing my heart out before I even knew what it wanted is mercy? Adrian flinched at her fury, but didn't look away. Clara's chest heaved as the dam inside her finally broke. You absolute fool, she whispered, tears brimming. You think I stayed here because of some contract? You think I defended you in front of all those people because of an obligation? Her voice cracked, trembling between rage and grief. I stayed because, somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you, Adrian. Against every ounce of reason, against every warning, my heart screamed at me. I fell in love with you. The confession tore free, raw and unpolished, echoing in the vast office like a secret too large to contain. Adrian froze. For a long, unbearable moment, he simply stared at her, his carefully built walls crumbling in his eyes. Clara wiped at her cheeks with shaking hands. And you were so busy drawing up escape routes that you didn't even see it. Her words hung in the air, a mixture of accusation and plea. Adrian came around the desk slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. His voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. Say it again. Clara's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. I love you, Adrian Cross, not because of the contract, not because of what you've done for my father. I love you, despite everything, despite you. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the weight of everything unspoken. Adrian's hand twitched at his side, like he wanted to reach for her, but didn't trust himself. I don't deserve that, he said finally, his voice hoarse. Maybe not, Clara whispered, but it doesn't make it less true. For once, Adrian's armor cracked entirely. His shoulders slumped, his breath uneven, and in his eyes, she saw it the same longing, the same fear, the same impossible love he had tried so hard to bury beneath contracts and control. The office felt smaller somehow, the distance between them unbearable. Adrian took a step forward. Clara didn't move. Whatever happened next, the silence between them had finally been broken. The silence in Adrian's office was electric, fragile, as though the whole city outside had paused to listen. Clara stood rigid, her hands trembling at her sides, still reeling from the weight of her own confession. The words she had never planned to speak now echoed between them, impossible to take back. Adrian's gray eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her want to look away and yet held her captive. He drew a breath as though steadying himself. I need you to understand, he began, his voice low, unsteady. I've built my life on control, every decision calculated, every outcome anticipated. But you, he shook his head, as though words themselves resisted him. You undid all of that. Clara swallowed, her throat raw. Then why hide it? Why the divorce papers? Why make me believe I meant nothing? His eyes darkened, pain flickering through them. Because I have never known how to hold something I couldn't control. And you, Clara, You were never part of the plan. You were chaos. You were real. His voice caught, the carefully measured cadence breaking. I've been in love with you since the moment you stood in that hospital room and called me a calculator to my face. Clara blinked, stunned. That was our first conversation. Yes, he said simply, a faint, broken smile tugging at his lips. And no one had ever dared to see me so clearly. You didn't fear me or flatter me. You defied me. And every day since, you've only proven I can't imagine this life without you. I thought I had to let you go before I lost you. But the truth is, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've already lost myself to you. Her breath hitched. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the space between them, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the raw honesty in his gaze. All this time, Clara whispered, we've been pretending, for the cameras, for society, even for ourselves. And yet, she drew in a shaky breath. This is the first moment that feels real. Adrian reached for her then, slowly, deliberately, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. His hand brushed her cheek, rough and warm, grounding her. Then let's stop pretending. And before she could answer, his lips found hers. It wasn't the calculated brush of mouths outside a courthouse, or the staged display for flashing cameras. This kiss was unmeasured, unplanned and unraveling. His hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer, while hers gripped the front of his shirt as though afraid he might disappear. Clara melted into him, the ache of betrayal, the sting of doubt dissolving in the fierce tenderness of the moment. Tears mingled with the kiss, salty and unashamed. Every fracture inside her seemed to knit together beneath the press of his mouth, every wall he had built crumbling under the weight of what had always been their love. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their foreheads resting together. This is madness, Clara whispered, her lips brushing his. Then let me be mad, Adrian murmured. Let me learn how to love you without contracts, without conditions. No more papers, no more pretenses, just us. Clara closed her eyes, letting his words sink into the deepest places of her heart. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she allowed herself to hope, not the fragile, desperate kind of hope that had driven her into this marriage, but something steadier, stronger. She opened her eyes, her voice steady. Then promise me one thing, anything. No more decisions about us made without me. No more shields. If you want this, if you want me, it has to be together. Equal, real. Adrian cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing away the remnants of her tears. I swear it. From this moment on, you are not my obligation. Clara, you are my choice. Her heart swelled so painfully she thought it might burst. And you, she whispered, her voice trembling with certainty, are mine. They kissed again, slower this time, softer, as though sealing a vow no contract could ever contain. When at last they parted, Clara let out a shaky laugh. Do you realize what we've just done? Adrian raised an eyebrow, his lips curving, fallen hopelessly in love. She smiled through her tears. Yes, and maybe saved ourselves in the process. He drew her against him, his chin resting atop her head, and for the first time since she'd stepped into this life of marble and steel, Clara felt at home, not in the penthouse, not in the empire Adrian had built, but in the circle of his arms, where pretense had finally given way to truth. For all their missteps, all the damage and deception, they stood now on the fragile edge of something worth fighting for, and both knew they would never go back to the coldness that had defined them before. This was no longer about contracts. This was love, raw and uncharted. The first snowfall of winter blanketed the city in soft white, muting its usual roar into something gentler. Clara stood by the penthouse window, watching flakes drift lazily past the glass. For the first time since she'd moved in, the space no longer felt like a cage. It felt tentatively like home, behind her. Adrian cleared his throat, She turned, expecting another briefing about a gala or dinner, but instead found him standing unusually still, his hands tucked into his pockets. There was no audience tonight, no cameras, no watchful eyes of society, just the two of them. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've been thinking about how we began, about how much of it was built on obligation, on fear, on control." He hesitated, then stepped forward, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I want to begin again." Clara's breath caught. Adrian opened the box, revealing a simple ring, no dazzling diamonds, no ostentatious display. Just a slender gold band, elegant and understated. "The first time, I asked you to marry me as part of a contract. Tonight, I ask you again not as a bargain, not as a condition, just as a man who loves you." Her eyes blurred with tears. The city lights behind him shimmered like stars. "Clara Bennett," Adrian continued, his voice trembling despite the steadiness of his gaze. "Will you marry me again? This time for no other reason but that we belong together." She pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart swelling so full it hurt. All the pain, all the doubt, all the walls between them seemed to dissolve in that moment. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, steadier. "Yes, Adrian." 1,000 times. "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands uncharacteristically unsteady. Then he drew her close, their foreheads touching, their laughter mingling with tears. There was no orchestra, no photographer, no flash of cameras, only the quiet hum of the city below and the steady beat of their hearts, finally aligned. A week later, they stood together in a small chapel tucked away in the countryside. The pews were half empty by design, no socialites, no press, no board members, just a handful of people who mattered. Clara's father sat in the front row, thinner than she remembered, but stronger now, his eyes glistening with pride. He had made the trip from Switzerland only recently, his recovery a testament to resilience. Adrian reached for Clara's hands at the altar, his grip warm, steady. They exchanged vows not drafted by lawyers, but spoken from trembling lips, words that carried the weight of truth. "I choose you," Adrian said, his voice cracking. "Not for efficiency, not for appearances, but because loving you is the only choice I want to make, every day, for the rest of my life." Clara's tears spilled freely. "And I choose you, not because I need you to save me, but because you already have, by showing me the man you really are." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian didn't hesitate. His kiss was tender, reverent, filled with promises that needed no paper to be binding. Applause filled the chapel. Clara glanced at her father, who stood slowly, leaning on his cane. His smile was wide, his eyes wet with emotion. For the first time since tragedy had shattered her life, Clara saw him truly at peace. Adrian slipped an arm around her waist as they walked down the aisle together, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners choosing a future they had built out of love. That evening, as the sun set over the snowy hills, Clara and Adrian sat by a fire in the chapel's small garden, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames flicker. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "You know," she murmured, "if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here, with you, I would have laughed in their face." Adrian chuckled softly. "If someone had told me I'd proposed twice to the same woman, I would have called them insane." "And yet," she teased, holding up her hand to admire the simple band. Here we are," he echoed, pressing a kiss to her temple. The world around them faded, the snow, the fire, the silence of the countryside. All that remained was the certainty that, after everything, they had found their way to each other, not through contracts, not through duty, but through love, and this time, nothing could take that away. The press conference had been Adrian's idea. Clara had resisted at first. Her instinct was to protect what they had found from the glare of flashbulbs and gossip columns. But Adrian was right. Rumors would never die on their own. If they wanted their truth to stand, they had to speak it themselves. So now she stood beside him at the front of a crowded ballroom, a wall of cameras and reporters facing them. questions buzzing like hornets waiting to be released. Adrian adjusted the microphone. For once, there was no icy detachment in his eyes. He reached for Clara's hand and laced his fingers with hers before he spoke. "Our marriage began under extraordinary circumstances," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "What started as an arrangement born of necessity, not romance, has become something neither of us anticipated." Murmurs rippled through the room, pens scratched, lenses clicked. Clara felt her pulse quicken, but she squeezed Adrian's hand tighter, grounding herself. Adrian glanced at her, then continued. "I know there has been speculation, accusations. Some have called me cold, ruthless, incapable of human connection. Perhaps I earned that reputation. But this woman beside me," his voice softened almost imperceptibly, "has shown me otherwise." Clara swallowed hard, her throat thick with emotion. When her turn came, she stepped forward. "When I agreed to marry Adrian, it wasn't out of love. It was a desperate choice to save my father's life. And for that, many judged us." She paused, steadying her breath. "But what no one saw was what came after. The man who defended me when others tried to tear me down. The man who, beneath the armor of business and power, has a heart worth knowing, a heart worth loving." The room erupted in shouts and flashes. "Mrs. Cross, are you saying you're truly in love with him?" Clara lifted her chin, meeting the barrage head on. "Yes, I love my husband. And if you doubt that, then you haven't been watching closely enough." A hush fell, as though even the skeptics had been disarmed by her certainty. But not everyone was convinced. From the back of the room, a familiar voice cut through Michael Grant. "You expect us to believe this fairy tale," he scoffed, stepping forward despite the security guards' protests. The great Adrian Cross suddenly transformed into a doting husband. It's a performance, just like everything else he does. Cameras swung toward him. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Clara's instinct was to retreat, but Adrian's hand tightened around hers. Instead of shrinking, he turned with her to face the man head on. "You're right about one thing, Grant," Adrian said evenly. "For years, I did treat everything as performance, as strategy. But love is not a strategy. It's the one thing I can't control, can't calculate." He drew Clara closer, his voice steady, but his eyes burning. "And it's the one thing I will fight to protect." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, unexpectedly, applause broke out first from one corner of the room, then spreading like wildfire. Not everyone clapped, of course. Doubt still lingered, as it always would. But enough did. Security finally escorted Grant out, his protests drowned by the swell of noise. Adrian turned to Clara, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "We'll always face critics, but if we face them together," she smiled through the tears threatening her eyes, "then they don't stand a chance." That evening, after the chaos had died down and the headlines had begun to spin, Clara and Adrian walked through Central Park. The snow was still falling lightly, crunching beneath their boots. For the first time in months, Clara felt no weight on her chest. "They'll keep talking," she said softly. "They always do." Adrian squeezed her hand. "Let them. The truth is ours, not theirs." She looked up at him, at the man who had once seemed untouchable, and felt a warmth bloom in her chest. "You know, I think this is the first time we've really stepped into the world as ourselves. No contracts, no masks." He stopped walking, turning to face her beneath the glow of a lamppost. Snowflakes clung to his dark hair, his eyes softened by the light. "And how does it feel, Mrs. Cross?" Clara smiled, her breath visible in the cold air, like freedom. He leaned down, kissing her gently, unhurried, as though they had all the time in the world. Passers-by glanced, some whispering, some smiling, but neither cared. They had faced the storm of public judgment. They had endured betrayal, doubt, and fear. And now, hand in hand, they walked forward not as a contract, not as a convenience, but as partners, proud, unshaken, together. The spring air was crisp, tinged with the faint perfume of blossoms as Clara stepped into the small garden courtyard. It wasn't the grand ballroom of a five-star hotel, nor the glittering cathedral society had expected. It was a quiet chapel, surrounded by ivy and stone, a place where vows could echo without being drowned out by cameras and gossip. She wore a dress of simple ivory silk, unadorned except for a thin ribbon at her waist. No jewels, no extravagant veil, just herself. Adrian stood waiting at the altar, his charcoal suit tailored as always. But there was something different in the way he carried himself tonight. The steel in his posture was still there, but softened by something new, something fragile and profound. The guests were few. Clara's father sat proudly in the front row, cane propped beside him, color returning to his face after months of recovery. Beside him sat Mia, Clara's oldest friend, tears already glimmering in her eyes. The rest were just a handful of people who had earned their place not by wealth, but by love and loyalty. On the windowsill behind the altar sat the small potted plant Clara had carried with her from her old apartment. Once frail and wilted, it now bloomed with bright green leaves and delicate white flowers. A quiet, living symbol that even in the coldest places, life could find a way. When Clara reached Adrian, he took her hands in his. His palms were warm, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. "The first time I asked you to marry me, I did it with a contract in my pocket. Tonight, I ask you with nothing but my heart." Her throat tightened, tears brimming. "Adrian, the first time I said yes, it was out of desperation. Tonight, it's out of love. Pure, simple love." They exchanged vows unpolished, deeply personal. No promises of efficiency or appearance this time. Just two people bearing their souls. "I vow," Adrian whispered, "to never again confuse control with love. You've taught me that what makes us human isn't what we build, but who we hold." "And I vow," Clara replied, her voice steady through tears, "to walk beside you, not behind you, to be your partner in every storm, and to remind you that even the coldest heart can bloom again." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian kissed her, no performance, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found home. Applause filled the courtyard. Clara's father rose shakily to his feet, clapping with all the strength he could muster. Clara's heart swelled at the sight. He had lived to see this moment, to see her not only safe, but happy. Adrian wrapped an arm around her as they turned to face their guests. For once, he didn't look like the man who ruled boardrooms. He looked like a man who had been remade by love. That evening, as twilight painted the sky with shades of lavender and gold, Clara and Adrian sat together on the chapel steps, away from the chatter and laughter inside. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting over his. The little plant sat nearby, its blossoms catching the fading light. "You know," she murmured, "I think Mr. Pickles has outgrown his pot." Adrian chuckled softly, the sound rare but rich. "Then we'll find him a garden, somewhere with sunlight and space. He deserves it." Clara smiled, tracing her thumb over his knuckles. "So do we." He turned his head, pressing a kiss into her hair. "So do we." For a long while, they sat in silence, listening to the night settle in. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what this means, not just for us, but for everything?" Adrian tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She gestured lightly, her gaze on the horizon. "We live in a world that worships systems, corporations, politics, money, cold, mechanical things. But none of it lasts without people, without humanity, without love." She paused, her chest tightening with the weight of the truth. Maybe that's what we're proof of, that even the coldest systems need warmth to survive. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. For years, I thought efficiency was everything. But efficiency doesn't heal. It doesn't forgive. It doesn't make life worth living. His arm tightened around her. You do. Clara closed her eyes, letting the words sink deep into her soul. Later, as their guests departed and the courtyard grew still, Clara walked to the windowsill and picked up the little plant. Its flowers glowed faintly in the lantern light. She turned back to Adrian, holding it out between them. We started with this, she said softly. A fragile thing in the middle of all your steel and glass. Now look at it. Adrian reached out, his hand covering hers around the pot. His gaze locked on hers, steady and sure. Now look at us. Clara's heart swelled, and she knew in that instant that no matter how cold the world could be, they had built something indestructible, something human, something alive. Epilogue. The next morning, headlines across the city buzzed with photos of Adrian and Clara walking hand in hand, smiling without fear, no contracts in sight. Some still doubted, some still sneered, but others quietly, hopefully saw something else. They saw proof that even the coldest man in the city could change, that love, stubborn and unrelenting, could thaw the iciest heart. And for Clara Bennett and Adrian Cross, that was enough. They had started in chains. They ended in freedom. And together, they stepped into a future where love was no longer an arrangement, but a force strong enough to challenge the world itself. At its heart, this story reminds us that even the strongest walls can crumble when touched by love and compassion. Adrian Cross built a world of power, wealth, and control, yet none of it could shield him from loneliness. Clara Bennett entered his life not by choice, but through sacrifice, a desperate daughter willing to give everything for her father. What began as a contract became a revelation that true strength is not measured in money or status, but in the courage to be vulnerable. For those of us who have lived long enough to see life's seasons, this truth resonates deeply. We spend years building, protecting, surviving. But sometimes we forget the simple warmth of humanity. No empire, no career, no system can last without love at its core. It is compassion that carries us through hardship, and it is connection that gives meaning to our days. So, the lesson is clear: never underestimate the power of love to transform even the coldest hearts, and never fear offering your own heart, even when it feels risky. In the end, it is not efficiency or control that defines our legacy. It is the people we have touched and the love we have given. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with us and walking through every chapter of this journey. Stories like Clara and Adrian's remind us of the power of love, sacrifice, and second chances, and it means so much to share these moments with you. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more inspiring stories filled with hope, reflection, and meaning. And don't forget, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this journey spoke to you the most. Together, let's keep spreading stories that warm the heart and remind us what truly matters in life.